on this webinar on contextualizing ethical, legal, and social implications in African genomics, law, ethics, and society in practice. So I'll be taking you through this opening segment of today's session. I'm not the moderator. And we are delighted to have such a distinguished panel here with us today and an interdisciplinary audience joining us from across different sectors and different regions. Before we begin, I'll just share a few housekeeping points. This session is being recorded for documentation purposes. Um, I'd also like everybody to keep their microphones muted throughout the session. You're encouraged to post your thoughts, to share your thoughts, your questions, comments, whatever it is that you'd have to share with us in the chat box. And please note that there'll also be a dedicated Q&A session at the end where all your questions are addressed. Now, today's webinar is organized by the Medical Law Hub in collaboration with the Center for Rights and Equality in Health Law at Leicester Law School, University of Leicester, and the Wellcome Trust. This webinar focuses on a critical and evolving area, the ethical, legal, and social implications, commonly referred to as ELSI of genomics in African context. At the heart of today's discussion is the key question: how can African genomics move beyond parallel discussions of law, ethics, and science towards a synchronized model where legal frameworks, ethical governance, and lived community experience are embedded from design to implementation? It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers who will do justice to this question and the topic in general. We have with us today Dr. Lukman Abdurrauf, we have Chioma Uselu, we have Dr. Kiera Staunton, we have Deborah Ekusai Sebata, and our distinguished moderator for today's session is Mutiat Afolabi. I'm going to quickly read their bios and we'll come back to them and get this session rolling. So for our speakers, I'll start with Dr. Lukman Abdurrauf. Dr. Abdurrauf is an associate professor of public law at the University of Ilorin, Nigeria, specializing in data privacy, AI governance, digital constitutionalism with a focus on African legal system. His research examines the intersection of law, technology, and governance, particularly particularly data governance, regulatory design in just a minute, particularly data governance and regulatory design in regulatory design in the global south. He is a research fellow at Institute for International Comparative Law in Africa, University of Pretoria, and an honorary research fellow at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, with previous fellowships at Stanford University's Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences and at the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, South Africa. He has contributed to NIH-funded research on ELSI of health data in African context and serves on the editorial board of International Data Privacy Law. Our next speaker is Dr. Kiera Staunton, and she is a leading international authority on the ethical, legal, and social governance of genomics, biobanking, and health data. Her work centers on developing robust, forward-looking regulatory frameworks that enable responsible innovation across research, clinical care, and public health. She has served as a consultant to major public health bodies, including the World Health Organization, the Global Fund, and Africa CDC. Her work as lead consultant for WHO's guiding principle on human genome data as genome data access reflects her global standing. She is an honorary researcher at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. Our next speaker is Deborah Ekusai Sebata. She is a behavioral scientist and bioethics researcher affiliated with Makerere University and the Infectious Disease Research Collaboration, Uganda. She is at the final stage of her PhD in bioethics at Makerere University with over a decade of experience in interdisciplinary health research and ethics. Her work focuses on the ethical, social, and governance dimensions of genomic data sharing in African research contexts using qualitative and empirical approaches. She also serves on research ethics committees and contributes to initiatives on benefit sharing and equitable genomic research practices in genomic and health research. Our next speaker is Chioma Oselu. She is a PhD researcher in bioinformatics at Covenant University, Nigeria. Her research focuses on building reproducible pipelines for polygenic risk scores analysis to improve genetic risk prediction across African populations. She is a recipient of the L'Oreal UNESCO for Women in Science 2025 award and recognized for the scientific contribution of her doctoral research. Chioma currently serves as president of the ISCB Student Council Regional Student Group Nigeria, where she leads initiatives that strengthen bioinformatics training, mentorship, and community building across Nigeria. She's passionate about advancing inclusive genomic research and capacity building in Africa and regularly shares practical bioinformatics resources to support beginners and emerging scientists. Our moderator for today's session is Mutiat Afolabi. Mutiat Afolabi is a Wellcome Trust scholar and PhD researcher at the Leicester Law School, University of Leicester, specializing in the ethical, legal, and social implications of genomic technologies. Her doctoral research examines whole genome sequencing birth through a comparative UK Nigerian lens. She is a barrister of the Supreme Court of Nigeria with over 5 years of professional experience in health law, legal compliance, and data protection, driven by a commitment to advancing ethical, legally robust genomic practices in Africa and promoting equitable access to emerging technologies. Her work sits at the intersection of medical law, bioethics, and genomics, with a particular focus on contextualizing ELSI within African research and global policy environments. We are truly honored today to have such a diverse and accomplished panel. So I'm going to stop talking now and I am going to pass the baton over to our moderator to take it from here and take us through this topic and our questions. Mutiata Folabi, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Farida, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to say welcome to you all and special welcome to the speakers who are on the panel today. Thank you so much for honoring us. We invited you and you came. We're looking forward to learning from you. So, while building on the introductions that has been made by Farida, I would just like to briefly frame the focus of our discussion today before we move into the roundtable. And before we start the roundtable discussion, we'll have each speakers do like a reflection on their area of expertise that we've invited them today, like for 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll get into the discussion properly. But to just give a brief framing remarks around the center of today's conversation, which is looking at the ethical, legal, and social considerations around genomic research, particularly in Africa. So, in many cases, particularly in developing countries like Africa countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, just all the African countries doing African genomic research. So ELSI considerations, or also ELSI, tend to emerge after key scientific and institutional decisions have been made or looked around as regulatory or compliance checkpoints rather than as factors that should shape the research from the outset. So that is why we're having this discussion today, looking at what can we do, bring in stakeholders from science, genomic research, from law, from social, the societal context as well, legal and governance context as well, in how we can conduct genomic research in Africa, where governance frameworks, ethics works together, society works together, and the research, we're all working together in alignment to make sure that the research is carried out for the benefit of everyone in the society, while considering our own context and while considering what matters most to us. So this is the aim of the roundtable, not only to identify the ELSI challenges, but to explore this foundational question around what it would mean to embed law, ethics, governance, and social realities into genomic research from the start into all through implementation. So I'm really honored to have our special panel with us today. From the four perspectives, we have Chioma, who is going to be addressing us around genomics research and practice. We have Dr. Lukman, who is going to be looking around the legal and regulatory governance. We have Dr. Kiara, who's going to be looking around the cross-border data sharing, as well as data protection and governance as well. And we have Deborah, who is going to be focusing on the angle of behavioral and social realities. So thank you once again. And I would just like to invite you one by one, if you could just give a brief reflection on what is the most overlooked area of ELSI in African genomic research today, and what does ELSI look like? What would it look like in practice within African genomic research context based on your own area? So I would start with Chioma.
Good afternoon, everyone. So glad to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. And my name is Chioma Oselu, and so when we talk about ethics and governance in genomics, so I will be talking about ethics and governance in genomics and bioinformatics research, because that's my area and where I specifically work. So when we talk about ethics and governance in genomics, the conversation often is around policy and regulation, and that's the key issue. So the issue is that governance in genomics should not begin only when the ethical form is submitted, so or when the data is ready to be shared. Many of these decisions that shape ethical outcomes actually happen much earlier. And what I mean is they happen during the design of the research process itself. And this could involve data sets, methods, which are the algorithms we use for analysis, and then the pipelines itself. So as a bioinformatician, working on genomic data and specifically polygenic risk scores, I experienced these questions from the perspectives of research workflows, computational tools, and data sets. So my reflections today would basically focus on how ELSI considerations, intersect with these realities, these practical realities of doing genomic research, bioinformatics research in African contexts. Hence, my key message would be that ethical genomics in Africa, it goes beyond consent and governance frameworks. And as I mentioned earlier, it's basically about the design of the research process itself, how data sets, how algorithms and computational tools are designed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would move to Dr. Lukman, if he could give us his opening reflections as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me clearly. Good afternoon from this end, and it's a pleasure to be here. Of course, I do a whole lot of work on data protection. I work much more from the data protection perspective, and it is from that regard that I try to understand what is happening, or I try to understand what are the legal issues that will ordinarily arise in the context of genomic research. Basically, my point of entry, or my entry point, is from the context of a typical African, or from the context of genomics research that is being carried out in the African context. And then I look at it from a broader perspective of what is really happening in the global south, because much more of a reflection of, or what is happening in Africa is basically a reflection of what is happening in the global south. And I think some of the legal issues that we face are kind of similar in nature. So basically, it's not just about the data protection issues, which I think is very, very important, but much more about the legal issues, because I think that data protection issues is going to constitute a quite significant aspect of the legal issues when it comes to genomic research. I have quite a lot of reflections, basically, which has to do with trying to understand or trying to balance the legal requirement and ethical requirement. And sometimes we are being placed between these fixed, or we are being placed between the controversy of which one supersedes. Of course, from the perspective of a legal practitioner, from the perspective of somebody with a legal background, this is not a conversation I should really engage in. But when you are interacting with genomic research, or when you're interacting with issues of health research generally, whether you are a legal researcher or not, you really need to confront some of these issues. So basically, to wrap up this, the point I just need to say is that the legal issues or the data protection issues when it comes to genomic research are here to stay. Of course, they came quite recently, but they are now here to stay. And as genomic researchers, you have really no option but to seek better means of complying with the laws. So I think I'll just leave it at this for now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lukman. I'll move on to Dr. Kiara to give us our opening reflection as well.
Good afternoon, everyone from Cape Town. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So I've been involved in the development of and implementation of governance frameworks for about 15 years in the context of genomics. And it's within that context I'll make these remarks. First of all, I really want to make it clear that good governance is part of the design of good science. It's not separate from it. But good governance is part of the infrastructure that we need for collaboration and trust between research participants, as well, between research partners, as well as between research partners and participants. Too often in my experience, governance and compliance with the law is seen as a hurdle that you must overcome. How often we've heard that, I just need to get through ethics. And it's something that you need to overcome, and that it's slowing down science. That is the wrong way to look at it. It is not that. It is about ensuring that science is done in a manner that adheres to ethical and legal standards. And if you view it in that way, you really begin to see that good governance is a metric of trustworthiness. Now, I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't take time, expertise, and resources. But if it's done correctly, good governance and preparing for it can help in sustainability of genomics research. And there's a couple of things that I find that works well when we think about how do we embed ELSI within genomics research. First is I always encourage projects to take a governance by design approach. And by this, I mean embedding ethical, legal, and governance requirements directly into the design, development, and operations of genomics research. It is something that should not be applied down the line of a project, but it should be built into how the project works. A second thing I often see is that projects don't succeed in having good governance because they don't have the necessary expertise. To ensure that you have ELSI embedded within your project, you need to have the lawyers, you need to have the ethicists, you need to have the likes of Deborah, the social scientists. All of these are necessary to make sure that we do have an ELSI-informed approach to project. Another point that I find, and I'd be actually interested to hear what Lukman hears about this, is compliance, particularly with data protection, should not be seen as solely as a legal activity. It requires a team effort. Us lawyers, we know the law, the scientists know the science, but we need to talk together to figure out how we can ensure scientists comply with the law. It is about ensuring that we understand what the scientists understand what the law is, and that the lawyers understand what the science is. And finally, when we consider cross-border sharing of data, we really need to have systems in place to enable the cross-border sharing of data. But to think about what and how you're going to do it at a later stage, you need to think about that right at the beginning. What export permits do I need? What ethical approvals do I need? What is said in our data protection regulation? Data protection regulations are not about the restriction of sharing of data. What they do is about making sure that you process, use, and share data in a manner that complies and adheres to the right to data protection. So it's up to the researchers to figure out what mechanisms, what legal routes there are to share the data, and ensure that they have all of those processes in place. And that is why I really, really strongly advocate for this governance by design approach. Think about what we need to do and how we're going to do it at the beginning of the project, and then even much more easier way of doing the research. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kiara. So really important issues highlighted there. I would move to Deborah now to give us her own opening reflections on the behavioral and social angle.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I am glad to be part of this conversation. My work sits at the intersection of ethics, social science, and in African genomics. And I would like to emphasize that while guidelines, policies are key in the governance of genomics research, one thing I would like to leave you with is the fact that ethics is key, and the voices of the communities are fundamental. So many times you realize that social science or qualitative approaches are just considered as an add-on later, after the clinical trials have been started or after the survey has been started. Later is when they'll think and say, maybe we need to incorporate a social science perspective. But I would like to place emphasis on the role of social science research in the conduct of genomic studies. And this is because many times we want to understand the experiences of the participants whose sample has been taken. You have their genome. One thing I would like us to reflect on is the fact that if you have my genome, or if you have just part of it, you have my identity, and it's difficult to separate, say, the individual whose genome is out there from their community. And what am I trying to say is that genomics research is relational. I'm trying to bring about the relational bit of genomics research, genomics data, and the fact that many times we as researchers, we kind of place demands on research participants, asking them to join studies or to provide consent, and it's more of, has this been done? It's more of a checkpoint. Has the consent been provided? And someone ticks yes, no. But what we forget about is that it's beyond the individual, because the individual is tied to communities. The individual is tied to family, and just by them taking part in a study, there's so many ethical, legal, and social implications that come out of it. So, and that is the reason I am pushing for qualitative approaches to be done at the start. I would be glad to see in place situations where we come up with questions with the community, because we would like to ensure that the voice of the community is heard. And how better will we do this than speaking with them, meeting with them, coming up with questions that we think are key to them. I guess one of the things that we as researchers tend to forget is still in regard to the aspect of participation, is we forget about trust. Sometimes people take part in these studies because, one, there are power dynamics, probably they just want to take part, and we think that is based on trust, but that's not based on trust. Usually the trust is something that is built, and it is critical for the different participants to get back to their communities and to the people who matter to them. So that's the reason I advocate for for us to embed social science or qualitative approaches in the design and not later on after the study has started. Thank you. Those are my reflections for now.
Thank you so much, everyone. Those are all really great reflections. And from what you've said, everyone has highlighted like really important issues, and I can see some emerging threads here. Sorry, my video just went off. Can everyone still see me? Okay. Okay. Thank you. From, as I was saying, like from what all the speakers I've mentioned in their reflections, we are seeing emerging trends around like governance, around engaging the community, around ensuring we are carried everybody along when we're trying to do the research from the start, not just in the middle or at the end of it, or seeing it as a checkpoint, and not seeing like what we need to do to ensure there is a good, equitable, and ethical research is not leaving each burden or each roles to each individual or each stakeholders, but everyone working together as one, which leads me to my next question around genomic research design. So I'll go back to Chilma now. If you could just help us answer this question for better understanding on how is genomic research typically designed. I know you've mentioned that at the beginning around, dealing with the data sets, the methods, the pipelines, but if you could just do that brief breakdown of how that research is designed in African settings and where ELSI issues, all the considerations that have been highlighted so far, where do they enter the process, if at all? I know you said like around the consent, but it's trying to help us understand where is it at the beginning, how the team comes in, how the governance comes into play. If you could just help us paint that picture of how it is done in practice.
Yes. Thank you so much. So I'll draw examples and insights from my research. So I'm currently doing a research in polygenic risk scores at Covenant University. So I'm studying how to improve the prediction accuracy of current prediction models, especially cancer prediction models in African population. So a clear example from my research. So one thing we repeatedly see is that models developed in European datasets, they often lose their predictive power when applied to African populations. And basically, polygenic risk scores are models that are used to estimate an individual's genetic risk. So most of the data sets used to develop these models, they come from the European populations. And then as a result, when these tools are applied to African populations, their predictive accuracy drops significantly. So this raises an important ethical issue. So if those genomic tools perform poorly, for certain populations, that means integrating them into the clinic or public health settings can actually, worsen health inequalities. So improving representation in genomic data sets is a scientific priority. So it's not just a scientific priority, it's an ethical one. So that when we are building clinical risk models or when we're advancing precision medicine, underrepresented populations like the African populations are not left out. So another thing I would also like to point out is infrastructure. During when we are designing the research process, infrastructure comes into place, and this is often overlooked because. Let me also draw an example from my research. I also work on designing computational pipelines that account for resource constraints. So in many African institutions, running large genomic analysis is limited by infrastructure. And what do I mean by infrastructure? Computing systems in bioinformatics make use of a lots of data. So basically, that's the whole point of bioinformatics, using computational tools and methods to analyze, large genomic data. So in many African institutions, this analysis is limited by infrastructure. And if tools that if researchers are designing tools and they don't integrate these computational constraints, like if tools assume that there is unlimited computing resources, it becomes inaccessible. So African research institutions that face limitations in all these high performance compute, data storage capacity, and all of that, we need to look at how tools are designed from the scratch. If the analytical methods assume that there is unlimited computing resources, it will become difficult to actually implement these methods, these tools in many African research environments. So the key message here is that building tools that are efficient and reproducible is also part of the genomic science. So, and then the last thing I would also like to mention, talking about this research design in African context is that data governance and cross-border research, which one of the speakers already highlighted. So as earlier mentioned, many African genomic data sets are generated locally, right? But one thing is that some of them, or a number of them, are stored or analyzed on international platforms. So this raises like important questions like who controls the data, right? Who decides how it's being used and who benefits from the discoveries that come from it. So from the research side, these governance issues, they affect how we design collaborations and how we share data sets, how we build analytical pipelines. So when we say develop governance alongside scientific projects, so there are like 4 practical decisions that happen at the design stage. One is the consent design. So researchers need to know whether their study is collecting consent only for the immediate project or for future reuse. And then this involves, you have to inform your participants clearly that the genomic data that we're collecting from you, is it going to be widely shared? Is it going to be fully retractable once it's being used? You have to mention to them that it may not be fully retractable once it's been published or once it's been hosted on repositories. And that's for the first one, consent design. The second one is data access design. So before analysis begins, the project should define who can access the raw data versus the processed data. Because in bioinformatics, when we get data from after wet lab, research is done, we have the raw data, we have the processed data. So the project has to define from the get-go who has access to both of them, and then whether the access goes through a committee, what conditions apply to secondary users, and how local institutional oversight is maintained. So H3 Africa is now known as African Bioinformatics Institute. I have a number of resources that I'll probably share with the moderator after this talk. They have released a number of policies concerning this, and this is going to be really important for us to look into, if we want to learn more about this. And then that I talked about the consent design, data access design. The third one is infrastructure. And then the fourth one is benefit sharing and then capacity. And I'll round up with one example. There's this thing in, I won't really talk much about the legal aspect because, we have people in this panel already that will cover that. But I want to mention something that I've noticed in genomics research. So I want to talk briefly about the identification of data. So from the name, the identification of data, it involves the removal of personally identifying information when we collect data or when data is collected from participants. So some database, they use two-step the identification process and all of that. An example of a database that does that is dbGaP. So now in genomics, the identification helps, but it doesn't completely guarantee privacy. This is why I said so. There was a study by Jimrek in 2013, Jimrek and colleagues in 2013. So they actually showed in their study that the identified genomic data can actually be vulnerable to re-identification. What did they do? They re-identified those de-identified genomic data they actually wanted to prove something, that privacy protection cannot really privacy protection cannot just rely on the identification alone. We also need controlled access. We need strong governance. And if you're interested in how they did that, they basically use Y chromosome markers to infer the surnames. And if you want to read about that, I'll share resources with the moderator. So it goes deeper than that. It goes deeper than just the identifying their information. We need controlled access. And there's the platform DBGAP. DBGAP is a platform for genotype and phenotype data. They actually provide this controlled data access. So they provide individual level genomic data for research. And for individuals to have access to such data, you need to do some go through some application steps, and they only provide access to authorized investigators. So I guess I'll stop there before I.
Thank you so much, Chioma. That gives us a really good picture of how things operate in practice, and you've also identified some major issues there that I was thinking of when I'm going to ask the other people and speakers on the panel as well, which is like issues around the governance structure, around the design, around where we are hosting our data on international platforms, who then has the power over it, and in terms of sharing of the data once participants have already consented to it, like to what extent are we going to be following what the participants have consented to and adhering to that. So thank you so much for that insight, and I would take those questions to Dr. Lukman to help us bring the legal perspective into this. Like with all these issues that are happening in genomic research and practice from the African settings, if we were to bring the legal governance earlier and embedding it into it to make that change, where do we come in from legal perspective to ensure we have these institutional changes? What are the things that we could do?
Okay, wow, that's quite a very broad question, but I will try my best to probably provide some insights. I know Kiara is also here, and Kiara will be able to provide better or further insight on this. There are a lot of areas where legal governance will enter the genomic research process. There are just quite a whole lot. And I think that as a preliminary reflection, some of these areas or some of this aspect is beginning to be popular nowadays. And I think that even scientists are also becoming familiar with some of the areas. Of course, previous speakers have mentioned some very, very important or some very, very crucial aspects. One aspect has to do with, or one aspect basically deals with the protocol development and the research ethics review stage. And of course, this goes in line with what every one of us have been advocating. You should take into cognizance many of these issues at a very, very early stage. I know at a very early stage, ethics issues are usually put into consideration, but not so much of the legal issues are put into consideration in the African context. So in the protocol development stage, there are quite a number of legal issues that will ordinarily arise. Issues that will sometimes that has to do with the nature of the consent form. We know that sometimes there's this friction between ethics requirements and data protection requirement with regards to the type of consent. Is it broad consent? Is it, data protection law actually require specific and explicit consent? Then basically there are also issues that have to do with, or there's legal issues that will ordinarily arise when it comes to during the protocol stage or during the protocol stage. The protocol stage I'll basically focus on now, which basically has to do with letting us or letting legal inputs be there when it comes to issues of data sharing plan. How do you intend to use your data? How do you intend to share your data cross-border and all these issues? So this is one aspect again. Then there are also issues with regards to community engagement. What are the nature, when it comes to issues of genomic research? it's not when it comes to issues of genomic research, or when it comes to issues of genomic data, we are not basically talking about an individualistic approach. We're talking about how the data basically affects the community. What are the issues of dignity? What are the human rights, privacy issues that will ordinarily arise? And of course, as the last speaker has mentioned, there are issues that has to do with benefit sharing. When it comes to issues of benefit sharing, it's as much a legal issue now as it is an ethical issue. So basically, in the protocol development stage, and in the stage that basically has to do with getting approval for research ethics from research ethics committee, there are quite a number of legal issues that must come into place. Now, briefly, before I move on to the next point, what we have found, or in the context of quite a number of research we have done, that interoperability between research ethics committee and data protection institutions is not really so much there, or we don't really find so much of that in the African context. And we have advocated over and over again that there must be that handshake between research ethics committee and data protection committee, probably in the context of having a data protection expert as members of research ethics committee. I've not really had my hands on any practical example where we have this, but then this is part of the strong recommendations. On the side of the data protection authorities, we know that they are trying as much as possible to develop specific scientific guidance when it comes to issues of research. Another area where legal issues will ordinarily come into place has to do with the stage of trying to design or trying to work on a material transfer agreement or a data transfer agreement. Of course, agreements are agreements, and agreements are as much legal issues as they are ethical issues. And ordinarily, for a typical or for a very, very good material transfer agreement or data transfer agreement, there are quite a number of things that legal practitioners will be looking out for. What is the context of ownership and custody of data? What is the permitted use of data? What are the intellectual property issues that are basically contained in the agreement? What are the cross-border compliance issues that are contained in the agreement? So these are quite very significant or very germane issues or clauses that we'll ordinarily expect. And it's not just about having these clauses. What are the nature of the clauses? Because we are dealing with communities sometimes that are in the global south or African communities. And basically, sometimes they could be exploitative tendencies and so on. So you have to be careful to ensure that those are carefully drafted, they are carefully crafted, and so on, because they are as much legal issues as they are ethical and issues. The previous speaker basically spoke about a particular structure by the H3 for Africa, rather H3 Africa, and it's also something that I see quite a number of legal considerations that will come, and that is what we call the data and biospecimen access governance structure. This is quite important because, I think that H3 Africa basically has a data and biospecimen access governance structure, which comprises not just a governance framework, but basically some sort of a pseudo, let me use the word pseudo, quasi-institutional framework to ensure. Of course, it's limited in application because it only applies in the context of particular researches that are done within the context of the H3 Africa context. But there are quite a number of issues that I think that particular governance structure is taking into consideration, which basically goes on to law. Issues that has to do with compatibility with original consent. I think that the governance structure has that. Issues that has to do with data protection compliance, holistically, benefit sharing. Then, of course, very interestingly, as the previous speaker has just mentioned, issues that has to do with re-identification risk. This is one very important thing that will, as much, in fact, as she was speaking about it, I was really happy because these are some of the concerns we have in the legal community. Yes, we tell you that you can de-identify data, data could be pseudonymized, data could be anonymized. Of course, there are also a whole lot of confusion around the use of the concept, the identification, pseudonymization, anonymization, and so on and so forth. But basically, we know that with advances in computing, with advances in technology, there is no personal data, or there's no data that can totally be anonymized now, as we see. Finally, I'll just talk about this, but I have quite a number of them, but I'll just talk about this so that probably I'll also learn from other speakers. that basically has to do, or is a point that basically has to do with compliance with external regulatory regime in the context of Africa, especially when we know we rely on funding from external donors. We also have to put in place we also have to put in place considerations of how to ensure that we are legally compliant with external legal framework. Of course, the GDPR will always speak to us in a whole lot of context, but not only the GDPR. We are dealing with funds from foreign donors. They also have their data privacy policies and so on. How do we ensure that we comply with the data privacy policy? But I'm going to leave with I'm going to stop with one particular requirement. Sometimes issues of policies of funders, legal issues or legal policies of funders, sometimes we find that they are really in conflict with African data protection laws or African data protection legal principles or policies. In that regard, this is one area that is building controversy on how we should ordinarily deal with such kind of issues. So I'll stop here and I will probably think or will have an opportunity to discuss this further. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. This is a really interesting insight. And as you were talking, I was shaking my head because they are really important issues. And before Dr. Lukman goes, I just want to probe you a little bit on some things you said, because I know between you and Chioma, you've identified really big issues around like the issue of re-identification of data. Because this is really important because of in terms of genomic research as separate to other types of scientific research, because genomic research, the genomic data is quite distinct and unique because it relates you to a lot of to your family members, your history, like Deborah has said, and it's not something that can be changed like other forms of data, which makes us need to prioritize this when we're talking about data protection of genomic data. So, and around the issue that you mentioned also about the exploitative history that we've seen looking at global north, global south when research is being done, and talking about the funding, which is something that happened recently about the NIH stopping funding and how it's affecting African research as well. So just one question to probe you a little bit. Sorry to put you on the spot. Is like we know to an extent because of the lack of infrastructure in African research settings. So we tend to depend a lot on global north frameworks as well when we're doing governance, when we're doing the research. So since our governance approaches are we saying our governance approaches are shaped a lot by global north frameworks? How can we make sure that we can also stand independent of those frameworks when building our governance system by design within Africa?
That's quite a complicated question. And honestly speaking, I wish I'll be able to provide answers to you. You know, sometimes as academics, we just sit down and theorize, and the scientists will be looking at them, look at what they are saying, and so on. But basically, there's a research there's a research I did some time ago, and it's titled African Approaches to Data Protection Law. And basically, what I was trying to do unsuccessfully, in my view, it's left for anybody who takes up that research to read, is to try to see how we can Africanize data protection rules, or how we can domesticate, have a truly African data protection rule or data protection principles. Basically, the point that we always say, or the point that we'll always make, is that in trying to develop data protection, or in trying to develop most of these legal rules, even though we know we're dealing with a context where the kind of asymmetry basically that operates between both contexts. Sometimes we will always insist that you shouldn't lose your identity in the context of some of this, in the context of this research, because at the end of the day, most of the research that is being done, yes, with lower capacity in the context of African countries, is for the purpose of African people. And as much as this, what we'll ordinarily emphasize is the fact that we should really take particular cognizance of the human right of the African people. And that should be what is most important in terms of designing framework and so on. Of course, nobody really rejects the idea of transplantation or borrowing, but you have to borrow wisely. Look at what is really important, what you can really work, or what can really be workable for your community. take up that aspect, see how you can modify it within the context of the benefit of the community, not necessarily sometimes what comes out from, or it's not just all about the altruistic benefits that come from it. But again, like I tell you, we're basically theoretical researchers, and it's left for the scientists to give us what practical perspective they have on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Which is the reason why I had to ask that question was while I was doing my research, there was and I came about something online. I would not mention the country, but it's an African country. And they had, transplanted a particular governance framework from Australia. And the person that did the borrowing, rather than contextualizing it for its use, copied and pasted, and I could see Australia in there within the line of the section. I'm like, what is going on? Like, you had borrowed it, but you had not contextualized it for the use of what is meant to be done, which is not good. So it's good that we have the audience here. So if you're working in policy bodies and you needed to do this kind of work, in terms of while we are developing our own governance frameworks in Africa, and we're looking to other countries to do that, it's also trying to, dot the I's, look at the context, and see how it could apply to us here for our own benefit. Because even though laws can be borrowed, we still need to see how it's beneficial for the people within that country, within the continent. So thank you so much, Dr. Lukman. And on the topic of data sharing, I'm going to go to Dr. Kiara now. Looking at, we've talked about data sharing from Chioma, from Dr. Lukman, around how to enable genomic research in Africa, we need to collaborate. So we need to share data. We need to use resources in order to achieve what we need, the best outcomes. So Dr. Kiara, what tensions arise in this cross-border genomic data sharing across African jurisdictions? And how do the differences around that shape collaboration or affect collaboration in that sense?
Yeah, before getting on to that, I actually just want to pick up on something that Lukman said, which I think is really important and really interesting. So I work both within the African continent and within Europe. When I'm advising clients in Europe, it's all they're worried about is GDPR and data protection and the law. And the ethics is very much an afterthought. Whereas on the African continent, I find they're very much cognizant of the ethical issues. But the law is very much an afterthought. And I always find that quite interesting when working between these two domains. So when you can't talk about what the context of data sharing, like there's many tensions. First of all, there's a lack of trust often between those who they're sharing and who you're sharing with. There's a lot of examples of cases in which, there was samples and data were sent from South Africa, for example, up to Cambridge, and the data was used beyond the consent that's given. These are fundamental issues that must be done. The rules of engagement are clear. They were set out in a legally binding contract, but work was done on the samples and data that should not have been done. What I find a lot of the times when we are thinking about cross-border data sharing is that it's too much of an afterthought. It's not thought about at the beginning. If you want to share data, you need the consent of the participant. So you need that consent at the beginning. So you need to think at a very, very early stage, what do I want to do with this data? What research do I want to do on it? And with whom do I want to share it with? Then next, you need to look at your data protection law. Because as I said in my opening remarks, data protection is about enabling the sharing of data in a manner that protects the right to personal data. And most data protection laws, with exception maybe of Ghana, which doesn't have rules on cross-border data sharing, most data protection laws actually give you grounds and legal mechanisms on which to share data. So you need to think about what you're going to, for what purpose you're sharing the data for, and find a legal ground. And you need to explain that in your consent form. You need to explain that to your participants, and then make sure that you have the legal basis in which to share data. The problem is that there are different legal rules in every single country. So while we all have data protection laws, which is closely modelled on the GDPR from Europe, they're all a work that myself and Lukman and others have done. We published a paper early last year, which shows that while they're all quite similar, the reality is they're very, very different, and they all have different legal mechanisms to share data. And that can be a minefield to try and figure out and map actually the ways in which you can share data. And that is why you need people who have the legal expertise involved at a very, very early stage. I saw here in the chat, actually, a comment which they were talking about with respect to bridging the gap between data protection and activities of Research Ethics Committee. I believe the way to go forward is to embed data protection in the activities of Research Ethics Committee instead of the two existing in silos. I agree and I disagree. Because research ethics committees have a very, very important role in design and the governance of research. They also have a very, very important role in sharing data, both locally and internationally. And often many countries require that you need your research ethics committee to give approval. But the difference is research ethics committees have the competence to decide on methods, issues of research ethics. Data protection is an area of law that is exceptionally different from research ethics. They both have different normative foundations and they're both regulating different things. Research ethics is about the protection of the participants and ensuring that we balance the interests of society in having science with the interests of the participants. Data protection is only about the protection of personal data. And the thing is, the research ethics committees are generally very risk averse. They're very, very restrictive. They're very, very conservative for obvious reasons. So if we give them the responsibility, which they don't have the legal authority to do anyways. But I have, in my experience, where countries such as Ireland, I'm Irish in case anyone here, and I work with a lot of, I'm working on a project in Ireland, and they take a very, very risk-averse approach to interpreting data protection regulations. But going back to international data sharing, I think what's very, very important is a very early stage. Think about what data do I want to share? With whom do I want to share the data? And also remember, do I actually have to share the data? There are a lot of other mechanisms which you can give access to data without sharing data. We can use trusted research environments where you're giving someone access to the data, but they are staying locally. And there are mechanisms if your country has the infrastructure in which to share data, and it's much easier to keep control on the data. Because as we have seen, the experiences show that even if we have a legally binding agreement, if the data goes out, it doesn't necessarily mean that these are actually being used. And this is massive, massive impact upon local researchers, but also the trust of research participants. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kiara. I really liked the way you clarified the issue around how it's obtainable in research versus how it could be different when it comes to implementing the research, like clinically. And even though with the focus around our discussion has been around, genomic research itself, I would like to just probe you a little bit on, where do we then, what do we do differently when we're moving away from research and moving into clinical practice, implementation of those research outputs in terms of governance, in terms of data share. You're muted. You're muted right now.
Could you rephrase your question? I'm sorry, there's actually building works going on my balcony. I was struggling to hear you. So could you just mind rephrasing your question?
The noise is not coming through anyway, so you're good.
But you just could rephrase it for myself. I just couldn't hear.
Yes, I will. So in terms of use of data, how it is different in terms of what the objective of what the research ethics committee is looking into and the objective of data protection itself. So I'm seeing a bridge between, at the purpose of research, we find out what is going on, the issue, how we can address it. Then the main outcome is then implemented in clinical practice, which is the end result of research itself. So bridging in between how we're protecting data versus the research and ensuring that when we are sharing the data to other collaborators, how we can restrict the use of the data within the consent protocol that the data was received in. So like finding that balance between research and clinical practice. Did that make sense to you?
So it's about how do we strike the balance about ensuring that we can share the data for what it's needed for while also respecting the consent of the participant?
Yes.
I think, well, one of the most important thing is we often don't know what we want to do with the data. And, and that is one of the issues with consent is that I'm collecting the data in 2026, but I don't know what I'm going to want to do with 2036. So I think it's about the most important thing is about being as open and transparent as possible. I worked in a biobank in the north of Italy for 3 years, and we had a dynamic consent model. We had this interface in which it was an app or a website in which we could update our participants, ask them for, consent to other projects which we had not seen before. I often hear pushback against this within the African context, like, it's not actually feasible, where the reality is many countries, for example, we're designing one in Ireland, we use REDCap. And everyone uses REDCap. It is actually easy to design a dynamic consent interface. However, I will say there is at times an over-reliance and an over-discussion on consent. Consent is one safeguard. What's also incredibly important is the governance. What is the access control? Who is deciding? Consent is, if we rely only as consent as a safeguard, it's putting a lot of pressure or responsibility on the participant to know and understand and control the data. I've been working in the governance of genomics for 15 years. I have no idea what the scientists are doing. They can tell me they want the consent for X, Y, and Z. But in reality, I fully don't understand the risks that's involved because I don't understand the science. So for me, what's more important is you tell me what governance has. Is there a data access committee that's going to be responsible for overseeing? What are the safeguards? What are the risks that they're looking for? Because while the advent of data protection regulations has been fantastic, it has meant that data protection regulations have become a default research regulatory framework when they were not designed to do that. But it also has meant that we are kind of only seeing re-identification as the only risk. Re-identification is a risk, but it is not the only risk. In the context of genomic data sharing, and genomic research, stigmatization, discrimination, these are all real and prevalent risks that we have seen play out in practice. While there is, as Choma mentioned, re-identification is possible, the reality is we have seen communities and populations stigmatized because of research. So what controls and mechanisms are in place to ensure that we don't have research which is going to stigmatize and discriminate? One example is you have a data access committee. What we have also done in another a group that I work with that is working with an Indigenous population is that they are actually involved in the interpretation of results. So they are there, they're interpreting it, and that way the results of their community and their population are interpreted in a way in which they are agreeing up, and they ensure that they are not going to be stigmatized and discriminated against.
Thank
I'll
you
stop
so
there.
much, Dr. Kara. Thank you. Just before I get to Ms. Deborah to bring how this reflect and practice within the community, I just want to put one question to Chioma in terms of how whether what Dr. Kara said aligns with your experience within genomic research practice in your area within Africa or Nigeria specifically, since that's where you're focusing your research. In terms of
Yes.
okay.
No, you can
Now,
buttress
just
further,
like
please.
trying to get, that paint that picture of she's the insight she's given with the recommendations. Do we have that currently in terms of each research group having their own data access committee, in terms of having that governance oversight on what is being done? If any issues needs to change during the research process, somebody that needs a legal governance expert that can come in. Is that how it is obtained in practice currently, or is this something that we need to work on?
Okay, so how should I frame this? I may not be able to speak fully in the aspect of how the data governance of how these data sets are being handled, because so it's the wet lab scientists that would know better about this part. So my area focuses on using those data sets, retrieving it from databases, and then using it for my research. So I made an example of dbGaP, so which is the database for genotype and phenotype information. For my research, I had to apply for data from dbGaP. And I mentioned that dbGaP uses a controlled access format to access data. So before data is being submitted on dbGaP, they are being told by the part of the rules is to de-identify the data. So, for example, there's a genome-wide association study or genotypic study of thousands of participants. So what happens is that they change the names and their personal information using IDs. Like for family, they use FIDs. For maternal, paternal, they use MIDs, IIDs, and all of that. So we just use like a code. So researchers are depositing data on DBGAP. For example, they are told to de-identify this data, and that's so from my end, I would say that studies should integrate this more, like frameworks during the research design process for wet lab researchers when when they are generating their data or during experimentation. They should integrate things like this, not just data access control. It should be controlled because they should be able to before they obtain such data, they should require authorized access, which needs to be approved. Before following some, they have to meet some conditions. Before it's being approved, and this process can actually take a while. So on some platforms, when you apply for such controlled access data, it can take months, and that's because they are. I would like to think, based on what they provide in their documentation, that they are working, to make sure that everything you said in your application that you are going to, what you said you're going to use the data for, is actually what you're going to use it for, and all of that. Yes.
Thank you so much, Chioma. So we'll now shift slightly from regulatory structures to lived realities. So I'm going to pose my question to Deborah now, since this is our area of expertise. Everyone could also chip in later on. But I'd just like her to, with all that has been said about how the research is being done, how governance could impact genomic research, is then how we can reflect, how does this reflect in realities of what the community face, who are the people that are participating in this research, who are participants of the research, and how do communities interpret genomic research and data sharing beyond the formal consent itself. So like helping us understand in terms of the trust, the participation, what research is promised and what it actually is.
Thank you so much for that question. That is something that I keep reflecting on, and the fact that many times we engage with these communities, but what do we actually think about the communities? How do we think about them? We promise so many things to these communities or the community members, but what is our bargain? What is our role when it comes to sticking to what we say we will do? One thing that I will place emphasis on is the fact that when it comes to consent, or the consent process with genomics research is different. While we are used to consent being done mainly by one person, it's one-on-one, and we are quick to get responses. With genomics, it's a bit different. The context is different because of the social implications that Kara has just mentioned. It goes beyond just the individual, and many times people want to go back and consult, say, with family, with their siblings, with the parents, with the community, because just by taking part in agreeing to take part in a study, you'll never know what the implications would be. They might be able to come up with results that you weren't prepared to receive. So, and that takes us back to the issue of consent. Many times we end up using consent forms that are not even tailored to the needs of the community. So we have adopted consent forms, and it's like I mentioned earlier on, a checklist. It's more of a checklist, and we're just thinking of, have we ticked this out? Have we ticked this out? My research, the findings of my research have shown that genomic illiteracy stands out really strong, and this genomic illiteracy is when we look at the researchers, it's not only the community that is affected by genomic illiteracy, but even the researchers who have to explain the concepts to the research participants struggle with trying to break down the terms that are in genomics research. So how do you break down, I guess the question is, how do you break down these terms that are considered complex without losing the meaning? So now when we get away from the researchers and now look at the research ethics committee members, how empowered are they? Do they actually understand the concepts as well? I guess the assumption is that during the ethics review process, they will assign a protocol to people who have expertise in say genomics research, but still at the end of the day, when it comes to voting, everyone has to vote. So what is happening? Even people who are not very conversant with, say, the terminology involved in genomics research still have to vote. When we look at the regulators, what happens? Are we empowered? Are the regulators empowered enough to ensure that these studies that are being approved are in line with what they should be? When we look at the community itself, the community has to understand the different concepts, and then this still brings about relational issues. They have to go back and consult with the key people who are involved. But we as researchers, are we willing to wait? How long are we willing to wait for the research participants to come back and say, okay, I think I understand. I understand what is entailed in this. I have gotten concept, because that takes us back to the fact that now the people who we are asking to consent have diminished autonomy, because if they cannot make decisions on their own and they have to depend on family and community to provide guidance regarding decisions, they have to take decisions around participation in research. Are we looking at that? What lens are we looking at? And then, yes, we are talking about the data being de-identified, and we forget about the fact that this data is unique to participants. It has implications on the community that has shared the data. There are issues around misuse of data, just like Kara mentioned. Many times researchers will say they're going to use the data for something else, but I guess it's rather hard to know or to stick by that sometimes. And also, given the fact that this data is shared globally, how do we ensure that the data that is shared remains within the confines of what we said we would do? Many times the research participants believe in the researchers and they have built a relationship with the researchers, and many times they will agree to take part in these studies. But what is our role as researchers? How do we ensure that the communities are being protected, and yet this research or the data is shared? Sometimes it's like Kilma mentioned, it's beyond it's beyond the researcher who has shared the data, because you do not have control over it anymore. Who makes decisions? And that's the reason I am advocating for us to have qualitative research, basically to understand the views of the research participant, to understand their fears, their experiences. Yes, after they have provided this data and now they are aware of the risk that is entailed, how can they ensure still comfort? How can you speak through them? That's why having, say, conversations with them just to find out what their experiences are, what their views are, what their thoughts are, is really key. Or even just being able to come up with questions where their input is key. Say if you involve them from the design level, then rather than at the end, they will buy into this research, they will buy into the idea, and they will feel that they have played a role. Many times we are talking about power dynamics and we're talking about the global north and global south, but there's lots of scenarios where there's power dynamics between the research participant and the researcher. Can the research participant speak freely? Are they ensured of protection? Are they ensured of, is the ground leveled? So that's the reason why I think it is key for us to involve, say, social science research at the start rather than at the end. We're talking about community representation. We're talking about community members, but are the members of the community advisory boards empowered enough to speak out on behalf of the different communities? And I guess that's why it takes us back to the fact that we need to involve the communities still, even in the translation of these consent forms, because if they're I guess we have gotten used to a system where we involve linguistics in the translation of these consent forms, and then you end up with translated forms which have lost meaning. Can we consider involving the community, even in just scenarios where there is need for them to double check and say, okay, this will protect the community, but they will not be able to do that if you have not allowed them in. So that's why it would be key as we think about the ethical, legal, and social, to think about how best to involve the community, to ensure the views of the community are protected and ensure that there is trust, because once one thing goes wrong, just it's important to note that that will affect the trust of the community, and the trust may not be worked on again. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Those are really interesting perspectives, like really eye-opening. It's also something that I always talk about in terms of something you mentioned about communication of research. And this is really important because genomic research is, in terms of the words, the terminologies, it's not something that people can easily understand when they pick it up. Even me as an academic, as a researcher, I'm reading some articles, on genomics research, and I don't understand it very well until I need to ask for more help, do more, breakdown of the terminologies going to the experts. And not everybody will be able to do that. Someone in the community will not be able to engage with that. Yeah, Gemma, I'm going to call you because this is a question I wanted to bring to you as well. Because it's something that I know there are people from different areas of from different parts of Africa that are in the audience, and where there are also genomic researchers as well. It's when you're communicating your research, try to know that you're communicating it to the society, people that are going to engage with your research, people that are going to participate in this research. So it's important for translation, as Deborah has said, in terms of engaging us, because without the society, then the research cannot be carried out. And where trust is lost, then the purpose of the research cannot be achieved as well. So, and I'll just take it back to Chioma.
Yes, and thank you so much. So actually, I have a question for Debbie.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So I can ask, right?
Yes.
Because I got really interested in what she said about her research being about the social aspect. So I actually wanted to ask, in the African context, we are very should I use the word religious, or should I say
we
have some
values.
Yes, we have our values, and we have some cultural values as well. So there's some research that because I've been involved in some breast cancer screening movement, prostate cancer screening movement in my research environment. And sometimes when we go to meet these people in low in the community, to talk to them about breast cancer and all of that, and to acquire data from them, we have to explain these things to them. And sometimes some of them, they are not willing to share that data. Some of them they have some cultural reservations concerning it, and they are not immediately willing to share. So when it comes to such, you explained and you mentioned that it would be good to actually sit with these participants and then tell them how their data will be used and all of that, which I think I also mentioned too. But I wanted to ask someone who is well informed in the field that, for example, when it comes to language barrier, so we should also know that most of this, or a number of this research done in the African context, are done by researchers, students, PhD students or master's students in a research setting. So there will be a PI, principal investigator, who would design the research and then assign masters and PhD students to carry it out. So when it comes to language barrier, sometimes a PhD student just wants to do their research and just I just want to graduate and just get my data, analyze and do all of that. So when it comes to things like that, how does one handle it? So I'm not in the wet lab field. I just use that. I use data from generated from the aspect I'm asking because I'm genuinely curious. And then secondly, how they handle the aspect of the how do researchers handle the aspect of the cultural values of Africans, like when they don't want to share their data because of some cultural beliefs and reservations. Yeah.
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Choma, for those questions. One thing that I must say is that given that this is Africa, we're talking about Africa, there are certain traditional beliefs you will not run away from. Let me give an example of certain studies, and these are all genomic studies. So there were certain studies that I witnessed where participants were being asked to have part of their hair taken off. In other studies, they were being asked to have their nails cut, and these were supposed to be taken. And while a participant will think, okay, I guess this is a good study, maybe they're going to find out whether I have risk of breast cancer or something. When these different participants went back home and communicated with, say, concerned parties about the fact that they're being asked to have their hair taken away, maybe shared, they're being asked to have their nails cut off, of course, there were concerns from the community, concerns that we cannot run away from because we have communities and they have their myth that they attach to different aspects. So if you're asking someone to take off their hair, many times the school of thought is that I guess these people are going to maybe engage in witchcraft or engage in activities that may not be very good for the society or very good for the family as a whole. And that takes me to the aspect of one, community engagement, but also the role of community advisory board members. So the community advisory board members, the voice of the community, and they are the go-between the researcher and the community. So if you have a community, a CAB member going ahead of you and telling the community, explaining to them what is entailed and in the research and why there is need for that research to be done, that is helpful. But also there have been scenarios where, say, like the RICs have had to have conversations with the researchers. There was one particular study I heard of where I think the requirement was for hair to be cut off, and this hair was not just from the head, this was pubic hair. So what was the community supposed to think of? So in such a scenario, the researchers were asked to rethink the different aspects that they wanted the community to engage in. Now, when we come to the aspect of translation and the situation where the students are just in a hurry to get their research done, I think that shouldn't be the case, because if you're going into a community, then we need to ensure that the community is protected. There are measures in place to ensure that you're not just extracting from the community. There's been situations where most of the research has just been extractive. It's been just taken from the community. So when you're in a hurry to just conduct this research without putting the interests of the community ahead, then it becomes a problem. And I guess that's what we are pushing for in research. How do we ensure the community is protected? If there is language barrier, then ensure that you have someone who understands the language well, who can do the translation, or have still a community representative. Right now, the push is for use of community representation or use of members from CABs to be able to help introduce the researchers to the community, but also ensure that they have actually read through the consent form or the tools, and the tools that the researcher is going to use speak well, are in line or are in sync with the interests of the community. I hope that answers your questions. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairman Deborah. I can see Damilari's hand, but before I come to you, I'm guessing you have a question, right? So can you just hold on for like a few minutes and then we'll come to you with the questions. We just need to round up the discussion and then we'll get to the questions. Yeah, thank you. Just to add to Deborah's points, just something that came to me while you were talking from my own perspective as well to Chioma is, as genomic researchers, from what she has said about, involving the community advisory boards, like it's also about, so I could see in the comment section about someone saying educating the community, which is important as well. So if this is something, even though like, these are students trying to get on with their research, but as far as I know, it's also a part of a research group and research groups are doing different projects at the same time, but the broad point of it is the research group will always be there. They're doing different things. They will always interact with the community to get their research done, so they need to continue to build their trust, that when you finish one project and you're going back to the community, if that trust has been shattered in the first one, then it's going to affect the next project. So seeing it as a that 360-degree point of view, that this will always come back around again, because we'll always continue to do research will continue to evolve. So if researchers can have that at the back of their mind as well. And I was also thinking about return of results, so that way the community don't feel you're always extracting from them. And I know Dr. Kiara is doing work around return of results, so if you could check, maybe I'll share the link to the work that she's doing, or if it's something she could share with us later on after the discussion, the webinar, we can share with everyone on our LinkedIn page and the website. So just the final question before we get to the question and answer session is to all the speakers. I know the purpose of this webinar is looking at how we can explore synchronized collaboration between genomic researchers, the people in governance, lawyers, ethics, and society. Just quickly from everyone, I'll start with Chioma, is how do you think, just one idea on how we can ensure this is possible to achieve synchronized collaboration between all the stakeholders in African genomic research? And comments can be written in the comment section by the audience as well. So Chioma, to you.
Sorry, my internet connection is a bit down. I
Okay,
kind
should
of
I
missed.
repeat that?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. So I was saying, like, a final question for us to round up the webinar is, we've identified different issues around African genomic research, how to achieve it, and the different interdisciplinary issues that could arise in terms of the research, the governance, the community engagement as well. So since the purpose is for us to start that conversation around everyone working together to achieve this benefit for the society, get the research done for the purpose of the community. So from your own point of view as a genomic researcher, what idea could you give in how we can optimize synchronized collaboration between all stakeholders?
So when it comes to collaboration between all stakeholders, one thing I would like to say is that cross-border collaboration is necessary and valuable, but collaboration without the governance built from the start is not going to yield what we eventually want, right? So drawing from what Dr. Kiara and what some of the speakers have said, so we want to move from African institutions just being sites of data extraction and recruitment, right, to them actually being part of the whole process. When data is generated, when data is recruited, when data is being collected and all of that, the control, who has the real control over the analysis, the access, the downstream benefit sharing, capacity. Governance should act from the start. Who publishes, who gains authorship, who receives training, which institutions gain infrastructure, and whether the benefits flow back to the populations whose data were actually extracted from. So reiterating what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of when I started talking, I actually referenced, I made mention of H3 Africa, now called African Bioinformatics Institute. They have a rich which resource on data governance. So they have informed consent guidelines. They have guidelines on consent and governance documents. And they one key thing they actually note in those guidelines is that the 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 sample and the data sharing must be anticipated early. So this is what Dr. Kiara also mentioned, and the speaker after me, he said that the use of the broad consent, and then also there should be clear limits on the withdrawal, the access procedures. So these are I think 2 points I would like to mention. Yes,
Thank you so much. So I'll go to Dr. Kiara. Are you still here?
Yes, I am. I'm just going to keep it very brief. I think what's key in all of this is an ELSI-informed approach to science. ELSI experts need to be involved early and they need to be involved throughout. And that's the only way we can truly be able to good governance and trustworthy science.
Thank you so much. I'll go to Debbie.
Yeah, I guess for me, the parting shots is let's ensure qualitative approaches are involved at the start rather than at the end, and let's involve the community. Let's hear their voices. Let's hear the voices of the community. Let's hear the experiences, because we cannot claim that we are doing research which is good for them if we do not involve them right from the start. Yeah, thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Lukman had to quickly excuse himself. So
I think I'm back.
okay, he's back. Oh, welcome back. All right. So,
Yeah.
one final thought on how we can embed
Okay,
synchronized
thank
development.
you. Thank you. All my colleagues have very much said most of what I wanted to hear. But again, strictly from the legal perspective, one aspect of a few aspects that I will hope to look out for, or that I will recommend that we need to look into, is trying to work on genomic specific regulatory or legal framework. And in this regard, of course, I'm not a champion of having a law for everything, but sometimes it will just be as simple as a regulation or an implementation guidelines to help us outline some of the nuances of the particular sector and so on. Then there's the issue of interoperability between health research ethics committee and data protection authorities. I think that handshake is very much necessary now than ever before. And then finally, we need to have some sort of harmonization at the regional level. Of course, the African Union is doing quite a lot when it comes to issues of genomic research or health research particularly. There should be some sort of normative, a kind of a top-bottom approach to ensure that we're able to work together as a continent, or work together or speak with a unified voice. I think these are a few of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really big thank. Can we just clap for all the speakers before we go to the Q&A session? If we could do that. Thank you so much. I can't find my smile. Okay, I can react. Let me clap. Thank you so much to all the speakers. It's really been a great and insightful discussion. So we'll just open to Q&A for like 5 to 10 minutes before we. So I could see Damilare, are you still here? Your hand was the first one that was raised. Okay, can you ask your question now? You're muted. If you could unmute yourself. Okay, while you're sorting that out, should I go to the next person? Okay, Gladys, can you ask your question? Gladys, I could see your hands up. Can you ask your question? Okay, I don't think she's here. So I'll go to the next person. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name very well. Asnakiu Mula. Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes.
I was trying to unmute myself earlier. I just got the permission now. Thank you so much to all the speakers. Quite insightful session. And to our moderator, thank you so much for that. I just wanted to ask, I have done a bit of research around, the ethics when it comes to genomics and, the research around it. And generally, Africa is always on the receiving end. And my question is going to be will be broad in a way that, any speaker can actually try to respond to it. And the question comes from a place of safeguarding the participant. We all know that Africa does not have a strong data governance regime. It's something that it's always an afterthought. And the reality is we try to follow whatever, we think suit at the moment. Is there something strong that assists in the research around genomics currently? And by strong, I mean a legal stand that protects, the participant, the researcher, more or less a guideline that makes it easy to go through the research work and to be certain of the direction in which the research will go. Like Dr. Sierra mentioned earlier, that it was quite a shock when compared to the European data governance regime. And I would like to know if there's anything strong enough to work with currently in Africa. Thank you.
If I might jump in, and I'm going to have to apologize. I have to leave after this as I need to physically get to a meeting on the hour. What I will actually say is the data protection regulations are in most African countries, and they are very, very good. But simply having the law is not enough. Are the institutions there sufficiently resources to oversee compliance? Now, when it comes to data protection regulation, you have a national supervisory authority. For example, in South Africa, it's the information regulation. Do those supervisory authorities have enough resources and capacity to fulfill its duties? Now, compliance with data protection regulations is done at a researcher level. So it's the institution that has the responsibility to ensure that everyone is compliant. But as someone mentioned already, compliance comes with a lot of costs. Having all of these security and safeguards in place are expensive, and many institutions simply do not have the resources to ensure that they can comply and actually meet these technical and legal or technical and organizational safeguards. And I think Lukeman can probably jump in and add more in this. But we have good laws. But that is not enough. These laws must be backed up with resources to ensure that we can supervise and ensure compliance. Again, I want to apologize. Thank you very much, but I have to physically get to the next meeting. Good afternoon, all.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Kiara. We really appreciate your presence. Have a lovely day. I don't know if Dr. Lukman would like to add to that question from Damilare before we move to.
Okay, I think Kiara has just put the point very beautifully. You see, there's a lot of beauty in data protection law, not because I actually practice or not because I work with data protection law, but many of the concerns that we raise are ordinarily or are envisaged by data protection laws and can properly be addressed by data protection law. Like she rightly said, it's one thing to have the laws, and it's another thing to be able to effectively monitor. It's another thing to be able to effectively ensure compliance with the law. The situation is not all that dark in Africa. Quite a number of data protection authorities are standing up to responsibilities, not even basically in terms of health research, but even in broader issues of holding what we call big tech to account, which I think are probably one of the strongest social, political, or economic entities in the world now. And we see data protection authorities in Africa standing up to their responsibilities and so on. So I believe that it's just a matter of time. Things will continue to, with little examples or with little templates here and there, data protection authorities will become stronger, and then we'll be able to ensure that they are able to do their work to protect the African population, even in the context of genomic research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just to add a little to that is, um, I would want to see a situation where, even though we have data protection laws, I'm kind of on the opinion that we need more. We need to do better, especially when it comes to genomic research. Because, like, going to, for example, the Nigeria Data Protection Act, I think more still needs to be done, especially for genomics data. So, I believe we need like a focused, specific regulation on genomic data, looking at how unique it is and how special it can be, and how there can be vast implication, negative implication, if that data is leaked or hacked, or like any issue comes happens to it. So it's just something I would like to add to that comment. And I don't know if Chema wanted to add anything to that, but if not, there is a question. Chema, do you have something you want to add to that before I move to the next question?
I don't have anything to add to that. It was concerning the last question you had. I think I had the wrong idea from your question. I thought you wanted us to talk about cross-border sharing and how specific, for example, my genomic research context relates to that in the African setting. I didn't realize that you wanted us to give a general overview of how the African context can benefit from it and work towards that. Yeah, so that's what I just meant.
Okay. Did you want to now say one last thing, then we go? Is that what you wanted to do?
Yeah, it's just a summary of everything I've been saying. So inclusion of African populations in data sets, African leadership, and fair access to the resulting report or diagnosis.
Thank you so much. Yes. So there's one question for Dr. Lukman in the chat, and it says that to what extent does regional regulations bind on countries within that region? And when do countries fall back on these regional regulations? It's kind of like a three-legged question. And then is it when they do not have country-specific laws? Can you see the question? Should I do it one
No,
after the
I can't see the question really, and I can't see the question. But if you could just take it for me again, let me follow
Okay,
more
so the
carefully.
first one is, to what extent does regional regulations bind on countries within that region? And when do countries fall back on those regulations?
That's an interesting question, really, honestly. And unfortunately, I don't have good news for you in this regard. I would have loved to say something better. I would have loved to say something much more interesting. But one of the problems we have in Africa is that, I wouldn't really call it an African problem. I think I should be cautious. I wouldn't really call it an African problem. But the problem we have is that our regional frameworks are we don't really give that kind of prominence to our regional frameworks, especially in terms of protection of personal data. Not only because the regional frameworks sometimes they came after the laws of individual countries, but because of the fact that so far regional organizations have not really been able to do much to in terms of enforcement powers, in terms of having teeth to work on countries. And of course, it goes to the larger issue of the structure of our regional bodies. But for ECOWAS, most of our regional bodies operate like intergovernmental organizations, not like the EU that have bodies that are structured in a supranatural way. In legal balance, these two have legal implication, because if it's an intergovernmental organization, you can only continue to negotiate, beg, and so on countries to adopt framework and to comply with your legal frameworks, and not like the supernatural organization structure where the EU laws are automatically binding, like the GDPR is automatically binding on many of the countries. So far, our regional frameworks have not really done so much when it comes to issues of protection of our people and so on. But we're now having a situation where regional bodies are coming together, like in the context of data protection now. We now have an association of data protection authorities that is coming and is becoming a formidable force in Africa. And it is the hope that this will do better. Again, I must also point out that there's now an attempt, I think there's some consultancy in place to make amendments or to replace the African Union Convention on cybersecurity and data and personal data protection. Likewise, I think there's also a consultancy out there to have a specific data classification convention or data classification framework. And I think that this initiative go with much more attempt at having that teeth or having better enforcement powers, having an overall coordinating and harmonizing powers among African states. But for now, there's no good news when it comes to regional frameworks.
Thank you so much. I really hope that this is something that we as the continent can work on eventually as researchers and all the stakeholders get involved. We raise more awareness about what we want and the benefits of this for the region. Thank you so much, Dr. Lukman. So Asnaku, if you still have your question, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hello and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. It was a nice and interesting discussion. Yeah, what I see in my experience, sometimes this the genomic data restriction and on data management ethics. Sometimes in especially in wet laboratories when samples are coming for the diagnosis of infectious disease and such like. Such data are used wrongly. Maybe the patient is coming in the hospital and then it might be have a treatment, but the data are used for in the laboratory for long time. Some are reaching up to vaccine productions, but those owners are not benefited, and not also in the inside of the country, but also outside of the country. There are unregulated biological reagents are also entering into the country, maybe for the either it is a vaccine or contaminated of the infectious disease that causing a disease, and such types of problems are frequently observed in the animal health and in the plant health areas. So in the agriculture and the veterinary areas, those things are frequently. So from your experiences, what did you say, or what do you conclude that those regionally broad crossing contamination of biological reagents, and also in the research and in the especially in the research areas and hospitals also, those the data are wrongly used. Of course, there is an agreement between the the patients and the researchers or the hospitals, but those peoples are not benefited from what is obtained from that research. Thank you.
Okay, could I direct that question to Chioma? Just to confirm, Asnaki, your question is how do we make sure that the patient and participants benefit from the research? Is that what?
Yes.
So I'll Chioma first, and I'll go to Debbie.
Should it be really me or the part about participants benefiting from research? Okay, I'll speak from the angle of extracting data from what has already been deposited in databases, because that's basically what I work with. So as I mentioned earlier, for participants to benefit from research, I'll speak from the methodology aspect. So one thing I've noticed in my research is that I'm working on building predictive models, and I noticed that most of the tools we have now for predictive polygenic risk score cancer models, they were trained with European data, that's non-African data or data from European, and it's simply because the data we use to train these models are more for those for those guys. So the thing is, when we want to design methods now, so apart from the data aspect, we need to increase genomic representation, data representation. So apart from that, we need to, when we are designing methods and algorithms that would use this data to build these models, we need to integrate that. We need to integrate that African data sets are unique. We have different linkage disequilibrium. I don't want to go into genetics, but we have different effect sizes, the same different ways our variants are being affect the model. So when we design methods and algorithms, we need to put this into considerations. We shouldn't just design models that don't consider these factors. It needs to consider these factors at every step of the way, so that at the end of the day, the data sets that we acquire and we are working on would actually benefit those people, those people we got it from. So that this is the aspect I'm speaking from. So I would leave it to Dr. Lukman to talk about the legal aspect. Yes.
Yeah, I actually pointed it to you because, since we were saying our participants would benefit, because, you're the ones dealing with the research. So, and the outcome of the research would come from you and knowing how we can benefit from it. So maybe return of results, making sure we know what has come out of it, so we know how to engage better, that kind of thing. So I'll go to Deborah now because she deals with, the social community aspect of it. So, what is your advice or comments on how participants can benefit from research? Just in 1 minute, please.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. So from my research, we have found that we do not have benefit sharing frameworks in our country, and that happens to be the case in most African countries where we do not have benefit sharing frameworks. And the question is, in a situation where we do not have benefit sharing frameworks, how do we ensure equity? How do we ensure fairness of the researcher who shared this data and of the participant whose data was shared, and even the community? And that's something we're trying to advocate for in pushing for the development of benefit sharing frameworks to ensure that communities that provided their samples or whose data was shared are not left out. But otherwise, in the absence of benefit sharing frameworks, there is a risk of exploitation. There is a risk that researchers may not even know that benefits have been, there's been benefits that have come out from the data that was shared. So outrightly, our culture as Africans, we tend to be very humble, polite, and we tend to think that if we have discussions around benefit sharing, many times we might be considered, we might be looked at with a different lens, and that might be risk for us to lose a collaboration. But what we are pushing for, what I'm pushing for, is for the discussions to be held around benefit sharing, and they should be held early, they should be held continuously to ensure that, yes, the community is protected. There is something that will go towards the community. There is something that will go towards people who have contributed their data without necessarily blinding them, but just ensuring that if there is anything that has been developed from this research, okay, is it vaccines? Is it medicine? Is it drugs? Does it have a commercial value to it? How can we ensure just ensuring that the community's interests are taken care of?
Thank you so much, Mr. Bora. That's really adept. Thank you. I'll just, Gladys, just a brief question, and then we go back to Farida to close. Gladys, you can unmute yourself now.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mutiat, for this, and to all the speakers. Okay, you said brief. I actually had 3 questions, but I'll try.
Send the 2 questions to us, and then we'll send it to the right speakers, and then we'll get the answers back to you. But for the purpose of the session trying to close, if you should just give us one of the questions, and we'll get the answers.
Okay, which one? Okay, so I'm going. Okay, I guess I'll just pick one, and the question is directed to Dr. Lukman, but then anybody on the panel who has some insights can share. So I'm coming from a background of I'm a medical doctor, and I started getting interested in genomics during medical school, and I was sad that we were not introduced to the concepts of genomic research in our medical school. and I attended University of Ibadan, which is considered one of the foremost medical schools in Nigeria, but we didn't know so much about it. So of course I did a lot of personal learning, and as a result, I started an organization which essentially introduces young researchers across Africa to genomics tools and technologies, and how we could, how it can essentially revolutionize healthcare in Africa, especially because we understand that there's underrepresentation. So maybe we need to be introducing young researchers a lot more. So it was in my learnings, and it was while learning that I came across all these ethical problems and implications about genomics research. So we decided as an organization that, okay, yeah, we are into capacity building, want to give people the capacity to carry out genomics research and all of that, but we must always put ethical components in whatever training programs that we are carrying out. So I think my question is very, very practical. So from a legal perspective, and as someone who has had to engage in this type of work, what do you think are the most important things that you if you were to introduce maybe somebody that is just starting out, what do you think are the most important things that people need to know at the onset? Of course, because all of these things, there's a lot of information, there's data governance, there's so many terms that we throw around. What are the most important things that we need to introduce young researchers to? And what are specific models that you would suggest that this training should be? Like, are we talking, let's say, fellowships, like specific ethics kind of fellowships, or should we just be introducing ethics components to what, like other topics? Like, what practical ways do you think we can introduce early career researchers to this, the most important things we need to introduce them to?
Thank you very much. And the question is loaded. In fact, I wonder how the other two questions would have been. Really, I really don't know. I'll try my best to just say very, very brief, to also talk very, very briefly, and probably you could probably reach out also on, and we'll discuss. You see, whenever it comes to talking to, or whenever you want to try to introduce issues of genomics or genomics research to legal, to scientists, I'll just call you, I'll call you broadly scientists. I know sometimes medical scientists will tell you we're not just ordinary scientists. Please just pardon me in this regard. So whenever you have to talk about issues of ethics or issues of law in the context of scientists, or in the context of probably trying to develop a training component for scientists, one aspect that I will want you, or one aspect that I think that is really important that you focus on, is the data protection aspect. And because the reason why I'm saying the data protection aspect, why I'm emphasizing the data protection aspect, is not because I'm taking ethics to be not important or not to be important, but I believe that ethics issues are already substantially taken care of to an extent. So basically what you should do is just to see how to make sure you are able to blend data protection with your already existing ethics principle. And honestly speaking, I'm telling you from the legal point of view, wherever there's conflict between legal rules and ethical rules, and legal rules will always take a precedent. So the research ethics committees are ordinarily subject to the provisions of the law. In fact, the Nigerian data protection law is very beautiful in that regard, in that it has an explicit provision, I think section 63 or section 62, that says whenever it comes to issues of processing of personal data at any circumstance, the provisions of the Nigerian Data Protection Act is superior to any kind of normative framework that you can think of. So basically, in terms of data protection, what are issues that you should think of? You should think of issues on consent. What is the nature of consent? How can you reconcile the consent requirement with the consent requirement in ethics, which basically the research ethics committee will give approval for, the consent requirement in data protection law? This is very important, because I know in ethics you talk about broad consent, but in data protection law, there's no room for broad consent except in peculiar circumstances. So you don't just work on broad consent. Data protection law, most data protection law, the kind of consent that is being anticipated is what we call explicit, specific consent, and so on. So the issues of trying to develop capacity or trying to let people understand what kind of consent is required is one aspect. There's also another issue of purpose specification. And in this regard, there's the issue of repurposing. for the purpose of processing of personal information. It's not just about specifying the purpose, because as Kiara has mentioned and as other speakers have mentioned, when it comes to issues of genomic data, it is not the particular purpose that you are collecting that is much more important. What are you going to use the data for subsequently, which probably even you, the scientists, may not know that you're going to use the data for this. So you need to be able to understand what is the context of purpose specification, what is the principle behind purpose specification. There's also principles on sensitivity. What are the extra rules that you need to comply with when it comes to issues? Because basically genomic data are inherently sensitive. I know there are arguments with regards to genomic data, health data, and so on. But what I would think is convenient for you is to understand the context as sensitive data. There's also very, very importantly, the cross-border sharing of data. When you need to move data between one context or another. Of course, when we talk about cross-border data sharing, it does not mean, or you don't think about it in the context of physically movement of your data or physical movement of your data infrastructure between one country and another. Sometimes when we see the interpretation of sharing or cross-border processing of data, mere access or mere providing access to a foreign database is sharing in the context of data protection law. So you need to know, and I'm going to stop here because it's a loaded question and I know I cannot exhaust it today, but I'll just stop here. Lastly, when it comes to issues of cross-border data sharing, there are quite a number of other alternative routes that you can use to achieve this, especially because the law is just developing. One aspect has to do with material transfer agreement, data transfer agreement, standard contractual clauses, and so on. These are a whole lot of things that you need to know, or scientists need to know, and you need to develop capacity on for you to be appreciated. Again, this is just probably 0.0001% of what you need to know, but this is just for me to find an escape route. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lukman. I think we overestimated 2 hours as being enough for this webinar. So maybe we eventually have to plan something where we invite each individual speakers to be able to go in depth into what we need to put African genomic research forward, focusing on the research, focusing on the community area, focusing on the governance aspect as well. We hope when we come back to you, you will be able to, accept our invitation again and then come back to give an in-depth speech or presentation on this. Thank you so much to all the speakers. I'm going to hand over to Farida to close us for the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for engaging in this discussion. Farida, back to you.
So much. Thank you to our wonderful moderator. This was a beautiful session. 2 hours went by so fast. I did not realize that the time had gone. Now, I don't even want to take so much of our time, so we're just going to quickly wrap up. But before we wrap up, I want to say thank you to all our speakers and our moderator and our participants for your engagement. Your questions were very smart and intelligent, very insightful. The responses given, wonderful. So before we close, I'm just going to say one thing very quickly. I'm going to be sharing a form so for us to sort of give our reflections on this webinar. It's a feedback form. So I want us to, I'll just put it in the chat box now, and I want us to please give our reflection on this webinar. But the last thing we have today is I am going to be inviting the founder of MedLawHub, Mr. Damilare Adeoye, to just give us parting remarks very briefly so that we can all go, because we've spent time here. So Mr. Damilare, please.
Thank you very much, everybody. I would not take our time here. I know it's over the 2-hour mark already. The speakers, we're glad you took the invitation and you delivered as expected, even beyond what would expect. I learned so much. I cannot lie. There's so much. I have the passion for interdisciplinary works, and this itself, it's a reflection of my idea of what we can do together as professionals in different disciplines, especially when it comes to issues with genomics, health law. You can't work without other professions, and that is what this hub is about: bringing together professionals and making it work for everybody. I really appreciate you coming here today, finding time to join us. Thank you to all the speakers, both the ones here and hopefully they get to watch this record to see that we really appreciate them. For those who have left already, thanks to all the participants. I hope you're taking something home today. And to our moderator as well, moderators rather, thank you for putting this together. It's been a wonderful time. And hopefully in this next coming month as well, we want you back here. We'll have better programs for you on the hub, of course, virtually. And you can always follow us on our pages on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, just to keep updated with whatever we have for you. Thank you so much, everybody, and do have a good evening. Okay, still afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.